After losing everything in the divorce, I thought the nightmare was over. Then my former in-laws showed up demanding my worthless lakefront mansion. What they discovered hidden beneath the property turned their greed into a battle they never expected. My name is Nia, 34 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful environmental geologist, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the foster system meant survival was my only privilege. But when I married Julian, I was pulled into the sprawling mansions of the Atlanta Black elite. Inside their world, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Their lifestyle was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My ex-husband Julian was a managing director at a top-tier investment fund, a man who built his career on charm and deception. When our marriage ended, he hid our marital assets in offshore accounts during the divorce. His father, Reginald, a terrifyingly corrupt corporate attorney, manipulated the legal system to ensure I walked away empty-handed. They left me with nothing but a neglected, overgrown, and supposedly toxic plot of land on Lake Lanier. They knew the property was saddled with $200,000 in back taxes. It was a calculated move to force me into bankruptcy and destroy my life completely. The ground shook before I even opened my eyes. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 months after the judge slammed his gavel and finalized my financial ruin. The deafening roar of a heavy diesel engine rattled the single-pane windows of the dilapidated lakefront cabin I was currently calling home. I threw off my thin blanket, my bare feet hitting the cold, warped floorboards. I did not bother changing out of my oversized sleep shirt. I marched out the front door and stared down the long dirt driveway. A massive yellow bulldozer was tearing through the rusted iron gates of my property. The wrought iron twisted and snapped like dry twigs under the metal treads, the loud crunching sound echoing across the quiet water of the lake. Standing just behind the machine, wearing custom Italian suits that looked utterly ridiculous in the thick Georgia humidity, were the 2 men responsible for my current living situation. My ex-husband Julian and his brother-in-law Sterling. Sterling was a ruthless real estate developer who married Julian's sister Dominique. He was a man who constantly tried to prove his worth to my former father-in-law by being as cutthroat as possible. Julian adjusted his designer sunglasses, looking at my property with absolute disgust. He looked exactly the same as the day he lied under oath in court. Perfect posture, expensive haircut, and a smirk that suggested he owned the world. Sterling signaled the bulldozer operator to cut the engine. The sudden silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of the lake lapping against the muddy shore and the distant call of a bird. "What do you think you are doing?" I shouted, walking straight toward them. The wet mud squished between my toes, but I refused to break eye contact. Julian smiled, that same arrogant smirk that used to make my heart flutter and now just made my stomach turn. "We are doing you a favor, Nia," Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look at this place. You are living in a literal swamp. Sterling's company is taking it off your hands so you can finally move on. You do not own this land," I stated calmly, stopping a few feet away from them and crossing my arms. "The deed is in my name." Sterling stepped forward, pulling a pristine white envelope from his jacket pocket. He wiped a speck of dust from his expensive lapel before speaking. "Actually, Nia, my development firm filed a municipal claim this morning. You owe $200,000 to the county in back taxes. You have zero cash in your accounts. Your credit is completely destroyed. We are initiating a hostile takeover of the property to cover the tax burden. You should be thanking us for saving you from federal tax evasion charges." They were acting like kings of Atlanta, untouchable and supreme. They genuinely believed that because they had money and influence, they could simply march onto my property and bully me into submission. Julian tossed the white envelope onto the hood of my rusted car. "Pack your bags, loser." Julian laughed, his voice echoing with cruelty. "This worthless piece of trash land is ours now. Go find a cheap apartment in a bad neighborhood and leave the real estate to the professionals. You never belonged in our world anyway. You were always just a charity project that went wrong." His words were designed to hurt, to remind me of my humble beginnings and the devastating loss of my marriage. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to beg. He expected the broken, defeated woman who had walked out of the courtroom 3 months ago. But I was not that woman anymore. I had spent the last 90 days transforming my grief into pure, calculated focus. I looked at the envelope, then at Julian, and finally at the bulldozer idling just inches from my wooden porch. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought this land was just a tax burden, a clever trap Reginald had set to ensure my permanent ruin. But I am a geologist. While they saw a worthless patch of acidic dirt, I saw the hidden truth beneath the surface. I knew something they did not. I stepped directly in front of the massive metal blade of the bulldozer. The engine heat radiated against my skin, but I did not flinch. "Tell your driver to turn this machine around," I said, my voice steady and cold. "If one more tread crosses my property line, I will have you both arrested for trespassing and destruction of private property." Sterling laughed out loud, throwing his head back. "You have no power here, Nia. You are broke, you are alone, and you are standing in the way of progress. Move aside before you get hurt." I did not move. I stared them down, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me intimidated. "You filed a municipal claim," I said, maintaining my calm demeanor. "But a claim is not a deed, and the tax deadline is not until the end of the month. Until then, this land belongs to me. You have exactly 10 seconds to get this machine off my property before I call the sheriff." Julian shook his head, looking at me with fake pity. "You are delusional, Nia. You have always been delusional. You cannot afford to fight us. My father has judges in his pocket. We will tie you up in litigation until you are starving on the street. Just take the envelope. There is a bus ticket inside and enough cash to rent a room somewhere far away from us." I smiled then. It was a small, knowing smile that made Julian falter for a fraction of a second. I reached out, picked up the envelope from the hood of my car, and slowly tore it in half, letting the pieces fall into the mud. "I am not going anywhere, Julian," I said softly. "And I am definitely not giving you this land." Sterling's face turned red with anger. He gestured aggressively to the bulldozer operator. "Start the engine," he yelled. "We are clearing this trash today." The diesel engine roared to life, a thick cloud of black exhaust billowing into the humid morning air. The massive machine lurched forward, the heavy blade inching closer to where I stood. The ground vibrated beneath my feet, sending a tremor of pure adrenaline through my body. I did not step back. I pulled my phone from my pocket, dialed a number I had memorized, and held it to my ear, keeping my eyes locked on Julian. "This is Nia," I said loudly over the noise of the engine. "I have 2 trespassers destroying my property at Lake Lanier. Yes, they are operating heavy machinery. I need deputies here immediately." Sterling cursed under his breath and signaled the driver to stop. He knew they were operating in a legal gray area. They had hoped to intimidate me into leaving before the law got involved. They had not expected resistance. "You are making a huge mistake," Julian snarled, his charming facade completely gone. "You are playing a game you do not understand. We will crush you, Nia." I put my phone back in my pocket. "The game has not even started yet, Julian. Now get off my land." The 2 men stared at me, pure hatred burning in their eyes. They had come to gloat, to deliver the final blow to my dignity. Instead, they were retreating. Sterling signaled the driver to back the bulldozer out of the driveway. The machine clanked and groaned as it reversed, leaving deep, ugly scars in the earth. Julian pointed a finger at me as he walked back toward his luxury vehicle. "This is not over," he shouted. "You will regret this. You will come crawling to us, begging for a way out." I watched in silence as they climbed into their expensive cars and drove away, the bulldozer slowly rolling down the street behind them. The quiet of the lake returned, but the air was still thick with tension. I looked down at the torn envelope in the mud, then turned my gaze toward the water. They were desperate to get this land. Their aggressive tactics confirmed what my preliminary geological surveys had already suggested. They had somehow discovered a piece of the secret. But they did not know the whole truth. They did not know the magnitude of what lay beneath my feet. And they definitely did not know that I had already set a trap that would swallow their entire empire whole. I walked back into the drafty cabin and closed the door. The interior was sparse, furnished only with a worn-out sofa, a small folding table, and stacks of geological survey maps scattered across every available surface. This cabin was a far cry from the luxurious Buckhead mansion I had shared with Julian, but it was mine. Every splintered floorboard, every leaky faucet, it all belonged to me. For the past 3 months, I had lived in isolation, analyzing soil samples, reviewing historical land surveys, and cross-referencing topological data. I had barely slept, fueled by a relentless desire to understand why Reginald had so easily surrendered this specific property during the divorce negotiations. Reginald was a man who fought over pennies, so he never surrendered anything unless it served a larger purpose. My research had uncovered the truth. The high acidity of the topsoil, the very thing that made the land look dead and worthless, was actually a byproduct of a massive dormant geothermal aquifer buried deep beneath the bedrock. It was a rare and incredibly valuable geological anomaly. I knew that a major international tech conglomerate had been quietly scouting the greater Atlanta area for months, searching for a location to build a revolutionary eco-friendly data center. They needed a massive natural cooling source. They needed exactly what was sitting directly underneath my dilapidated cabin. Julian and Sterling's sudden arrival confirmed my suspicions. Reginald must have caught wind of the tech conglomerate's search. He must have realized the true value of the land he had so arrogantly tossed to me in the divorce settlement. They thought they could bully me into handing it back for pennies. They thought my lack of funds and my isolation made me an easy target. I walked over to the folding table and looked at the complex map I had drawn. The aquifer did not just sit under my property, it was the absolute epicenter. I traced the property lines with my finger. Sterling's real estate development company had already started buying up the surrounding lots, preparing to package the entire area for the tech company. But without my central plot, their surrounding land was utterly useless. I was the key to a billion-dollar project. I picked up my coffee mug, the dark liquid inside cold and bitter. I took a sip anyway. The war had officially begun. They had the money, the political connections, and the ruthless ambition. But I had the science, the element of surprise, and absolutely nothing left to lose. I smiled, feeling a dangerous sense of calm wash over me. Julian wanted to destroy me. He was about to learn that immense pressure only creates diamonds. The sharp crunch of heavy tires on loose gravel broke the momentary silence outside my window. I turned away from my geological maps and looked through the cracked glass. A matte black Mercedes G-Class was rolling up my driveway, stopping mere inches from where Julian and Sterling had just retreated. The engine cut off with a heavy purr. I recognized the vehicle immediately. It belonged to Vivian, my former mother-in-law, and the reigning queen of Atlanta high society. She was a woman who wielded her wealth like a weapon, using her status on charity boards and country club committees to crush anyone who dared step out of line. I stepped back out onto the wooden porch, the humid Georgia air instantly wrapping around me. The driver's side door of the SUV swung open. Vivian stepped out into the mud wearing pristine white Prada trousers and stilettos that cost more than my entire wardrobe. She immediately pulled a silk handkerchief from her designer handbag and pressed it firmly against her nose. She closed her eyes in exaggerated disgust, pretending the faint sulfur scent of the geothermal soil was too much for her refined senses to bear. Julian and Sterling, who had been about to drive away, stopped their vehicles and walked back toward her. They looked like two scolded children eager to hide behind the matriarch of the family. Vivian ignored them completely. Her piercing gaze locked onto me. She navigated the uneven dirt path with terrifying precision, never once looking down at the mud ruining her expensive shoes. She stopped at the bottom of my porch steps, looking up at me as if I were a stain on the bottom of those very stilettos. "Look at you," Nia Vivian said, her voice muffled slightly by the silk handkerchief. "Living in a toxic swamp like some kind of feral animal. I suppose water always finds its own level. You could have left our family with a shred of dignity, but instead you choose to wallow in this filth just to be stubborn." I crossed my arms, refusing to let her see the anxiety spiking in my chest. I am not wallowing, Vivian. I am standing on my own property, a concept your son and son-in-law seem to have trouble grasping. Vivian lowered the handkerchief, a cold, calculated smile forming on her perfectly painted lips. Your property? She laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed across the lake. This land is a financial sinkhole just like you were to my son. Julian gave you everything. He elevated you from whatever foster care nightmare you came from, and you repaid him with endless demands. Now you are sitting on a plot of dead earth with a $200,000 tax lien hanging over your head. You are an embarrassment to the family name Nia. You always have been. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a crisp piece of paper. She held it between her manicured fingers for a moment before tossing it casually into the dirt at my feet. It was a cashier check. I could clearly read the bold print across the top. $10,000. Take the money, Nia Vivian commanded, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Pick up that check, go find a cheap lease in a rough neighborhood where you actually belong, and sign the deed over to Sterling today. Consider it a final act of charity from the family you disappointed. If you sign the paperwork now, we will handle the tax foreclosure before it becomes public record. I will not have my social circle reading about my former daughter-in-law having her land seized by the county like some common vagrant. Julian stepped forward, emboldened by his mother's presence. Just take the deal, Nia. You are out of options. You have zero leverage. I looked down at the $10,000 check lying in the Georgia mud. A few months ago, when I was completely blinded by grief and betrayal, that sum of money might have seemed like a lifeline. I might have picked it up, cried, and surrendered to their overwhelming power. But the woman they broke was gone. I was a scientist. I relied on hard facts, unbreakable data, and absolute precision. And the fact was they were standing on a gold mine trying to buy it with pocket change. I slowly looked up from the check, meeting Vivian's icy glare with one of my own. I did not move to pick up the paper. Instead, I calmly reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and tapped the screen once. I had kept the line open. Vivian frowned, her perfect eyebrows knitting together in confusion. What are you doing? I gave you an order. Pick up the check and sign the deed. I smiled, placing my phone back into my pocket. I am not signing anything, Vivian, and you might want to step back from my property line. The mud is ruining your Prada, and your presence is ruining my morning. How dare you speak to me like that? Vivian snarled, taking a step up onto the bottom stair of my porch. I can crush you with a single phone call, Nia. I can make sure no environmental consulting firm in this state ever looks at your resume. I will ruin you. Before she could finish her threat, the piercing wail of police sirens shattered the quiet morning air. The sound bounced off the water of the lake, growing louder and closer by the second. Julian spun around, looking back up the long dirt driveway. Sterling's face drained of color as two local sheriff cruisers came tearing down the path, their red and blue lights flashing brilliantly against the green canopy of the trees. The vehicles skidded to a halt directly behind Vivian's pristine Mercedes, kicking up a shower of gravel and dust. Four heavily armed deputies stepped out of the cruisers, hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, walked straight toward our standoff. Who called in the trespassing complaint? The sheriff asked, his voice booming over the lingering sound of the diesel engine. I raised my hand, keeping my eyes locked on Vivian. I did, Sheriff. These three individuals and their bulldozer operator are on my private property without permission. I have asked them to leave and they have refused. They are attempting to intimidate me into signing over my deed. Julian rushed forward, waving his hands frantically. Officer, this is a massive misunderstanding. I am Julian, and this is my mother, Vivian. You might know my former father-in-law, Reginald. He is a very prominent attorney in Atlanta. We are just dealing with a family dispute. My ex-wife here is facing tax foreclosure, and my brother-in-law's company is simply moving in equipment to secure the municipal claim. We are legally within our rights. The sheriff turned his attention to Julian, unimpressed by the name dropping. Is that right? He asked dryly. He looked over at me. Do they have a legal right to be on this land? No, sir, they do not. I stated clearly, pulling a folded legal document from my back pocket and handing it to the officer. That is a certified copy of my deed. As for the tax lien, they keep mentioning the county deadline for payment is not for another 30 days. Until that deadline passes and a formal court order is issued, this land is entirely my private property. They have zero municipal claims, zero legal standing, and absolutely no right to be here. The sheriff reviewed the document quickly, nodding as he verified my name. He turned back to Julian and Sterling, his expression hardening. The lady knows the law. A pending tax lien does not give you permission to invade private property with heavy machinery. You boys are trespassing. Sterling tried to intervene, pulling out his own phone. Let me call Reginald. He can explain the municipal codes to you, deputy. We have filed the preliminary paperwork. I do not care who you call, the sheriff interrupted, placing a hand firmly on his radio. You have 2 minutes to get yourselves that bulldozer and these vehicles off this property, or I am placing all of you under arrest for criminal trespassing and harassment. Do I make myself clear? Julian opened his mouth to argue, but Vivian held up a hand, silencing him instantly. She was furious, her chest heaving with suppressed rage, but she was also a master of self-preservation. She knew that getting arrested in the mud of Lake Lanier was not a headline she could spin to her country club friends. She looked down at the $10,000 check, now completely ruined by the wet dirt, and then looked back up at me. The mask of the polished socialite slipped, revealing the ruthless, vindictive predator underneath. Her eyes narrowed into deadly slits, promising absolute destruction. You think you have won today, Naya, Vivian said, her voice dripping with pure venom. You think calling the police makes you smart, but you just declared war on a family that owns this city. You want to keep this swamp fine. Keep it. But I promise you, by the time I am finished with you, you will not even have the dirt beneath your fingernails. I will strip you of your dignity, your career, and your sanity. You will beg me to take this land. I held her gaze, refusing to let her see any fear. I look forward to watching you try, Vivian. Now get off my property. Vivian turned sharply on her ruined heels and marched back to her Mercedes. Julian and Sterling scrambled to their own cars, signaling the bulldozer driver to immediately retreat up the driveway. The heavy machinery clanked loudly as it rolled away, followed by the sleek luxury vehicles of my former family. The sheriff and his deputies waited until the convoy was completely out of sight before turning back to me. You handled yourself well, the sheriff said, handing me back my deed. But those are powerful people. You need to be careful, ma'am. They will not stop just because I chased them off today. I know they will not, I replied, tucking the deed safely back into my pocket. But neither will I. The deputies returned to their cruisers and drove slowly up the path, leaving me alone once more. The silence of the lake washed over the property, but the air still crackled with the energy of the confrontation. I looked down at the torn pieces of the envelope and the ruined check slowly sinking into the mud. They had tried to break me with intimidation, with money, and with their overwhelming sense of entitlement, but they had failed to realize that their arrogance was their greatest weakness. Vivian's threat echoed in my mind. She promised to strip me of my career and my dignity. She was going to unleash Reginald's legal power and Julian's financial manipulation to starve me out before the 30-day tax deadline. They thought they were fighting a desperate woman clutching at a worthless piece of land. I walked back into my cabin and booted up my laptop. I pulled up the encrypted files detailing the massive geothermal aquifer and the billion-dollar tech conglomerate's secret development plans. The data was undeniable. The tech company needed this exact location to cool their revolutionary data center. Without my land, their entire regional infrastructure plan was dead in the water. Vivian and Reginald were about to play every dirty trick in the book to take this property, completely unaware that they were stepping into a trap I had meticulously designed. They were fighting for dirt. I was playing for a fortune. I opened a secure offshore banking portal, checking the balance of a blind trust I had established years before I ever met Julian. It was time to start moving the chess pieces. They wanted a war. I was going to give them a massacre. I packed my laptop into my leather satchel and locked the heavy deadbolt on the cabin door. The drive from the muddy shores of Lake Lanier to the concrete grid of downtown Atlanta took exactly 45 minutes. I used that time to let the morning adrenaline fade, replacing it with the cold, calculating logic that had always defined my professional career. Julian and his family had spent our entire marriage treating me like a charity case. An uncultured stray, they had graciously allowed to sit at their dining table. They saw my practical clothes, my lack of interest in their country club gossip, and my long hours in the field as proof of my inferiority. They completely ignored the fact that I was one of the most sought-after environmental and geological consultants in the Southeast. I parked in the dimly lit garage beneath a nondescript brick building. My office was on the third floor, a modest space I leased under my maiden name. There was no marble lobby, no receptionist, and no sweeping views of the skyline like Reginald enjoyed at his prestigious law firm. But behind the heavy wooden door of Suite 3B was a technological setup that rivaled federal research labs. I unlocked the door, flipped on the overhead fluorescent lights, and breathed in the familiar scent of ozone-aged paper and strong coffee. This was my true sanctuary. This was where I stripped away the emotional noise and dealt strictly in undeniable facts. I dropped my satchel onto my large drafting table and woke up my custom-built desktop array. 3 massive ultra-high-definition monitors flared to life, illuminating the dark corners of the room. My ex-husband thought he had left me with a worthless, toxic swamp. He thought the acidic topsoil and the faint, sulfurous smell of the property were proof of its absolute worthlessness. To the untrained eye, the land was a dead zone, unfit for luxury residential development and impossible to farm. Sterling had likely taken one look at the withered vegetation and assumed the land would be a cheap, easy acquisition once the taxes forced me into foreclosure. But they were looking at the dirt. I was looking at the crust of the earth. I clicked open a heavily encrypted file labeled Linear Project. The screens immediately populated with layers of complex data. On the left monitor, high-resolution satellite imaging showed the entire lake basin with my property highlighted in a bright red boundary. On the center monitor, I pulled up the chemical breakdowns from the dozens of deep-core soil samples I had extracted over the past 90 days. And on the right monitor, the crowning jewel of my research glowed in bright contrasting colors. It was a subterranean thermal scan mapping the temperature gradients deep beneath the Georgia clay. I leaned close to the screens, tracing the heat signatures with my fingertip. The high acidity of my topsoil was not a sign of toxic waste or industrial dumping. It was a natural geological phenomenon. Buried hundreds of feet beneath the bedrock of my property lay a massive dormant geothermal aquifer. The heat and specific mineral composition of the water deep below were slowly venting trace gases upward, altering the pH levels of the soil on the surface. It was a remarkably rare geological formation, a massive subterranean lake of perfectly stable, naturally cooled water surrounded by a unique bedrock structure. I tapped a few keys, overlaying the thermal scan with the property lines of the entire county. The aquifer was gigantic, stretching for miles in several directions, but it was trapped beneath impenetrable layers of solid granite. There was only one vulnerable access point, a single vertical fault line in the bedrock where drilling equipment could actually reach the subterranean lake without causing a catastrophic geological collapse. That fault line, the exact geographical epicenter of the entire aquifer, sat squarely beneath my dilapidated wooden cabin. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and smiled. The sheer magnitude of my discovery was exhilarating. I knew exactly why Reginald, Julian, and Sterling were suddenly so desperate to force me off this land. My private investigations over the last few weeks had uncovered a massive corporate secret, moving quietly through the upper echelons of Atlanta real estate. A global tech conglomerate, one of the top 5 largest software companies in the world, was currently scouting the metropolitan area. They were preparing to build a massive billion-dollar data center. Data centers generate an incredible amount of heat. Traditionally, cooling these massive server farms requires millions of gallons of municipal water and staggering amounts of electricity, creating a massive carbon footprint that tech companies are desperate to avoid. But this conglomerate had recently pledged to make their new infrastructure entirely carbon neutral. They were searching for a location where they could implement a revolutionary closed-loop geothermal cooling system. They needed a massive natural heat sink. They needed a deep, stable aquifer exactly like the one sitting underneath my property. Reginald was a highly connected corporate attorney. He had clearly heard whispers of the tech giant's search. He must have gathered enough information to realize that the Lake Lanier area was the target zone. I could easily picture the greedy realization dawning on him. He had convinced Julian to dump the property on me during the divorce, thinking it was a worthless liability. When he discovered the tech company's interest in the region, he panicked. He instructed Sterling to start buying up the cheap surrounding lots through a shell company preparing to package a massive real estate deal to present to the tech executives. But Reginald and Sterling were just real estate vultures. They did not understand the geology. They had looked at property maps, but they had not looked at the bedrock. They wrongly assumed that because they owned the acreage surrounding my lot, they could simply drill down and access the water from anywhere. They did not know about the granite shield. They did not know that my tiny, seemingly insignificant parcel of land was the only viable entry point for the entire cooling system. Without my land, the tech company could not access the aquifer. Without the aquifer, the billion-dollar eco-friendly data center could not be built. Sterling's development company had likely borrowed millions of dollars to acquire the surrounding lots, banking on a massive payout from the tech conglomerate. They were leveraging their entire corporate future on a real estate deal that was physically impossible to execute without my explicit cooperation. I pulled up the latest tax assessment for my property, $200,000. That was the number Julian and Vivian used to mock me. It was the amount they thought would break me. I minimized the tax document and opened the corporate valuation models I had drafted based on the tech company's previous acquisitions of geothermal sites. The numbers were staggering. The leasing rights for the primary access point to a geothermal heat sink of this magnitude, combined with the strategic value of the eco-friendly infrastructure, completely rewrote the property value. My land was not worth $200,000. At a conservative estimate, it was worth $80 million. $80 million. The number glowed on my screen bright and undeniable. I let the reality of it wash over me. My former family had spent our entire marriage making me feel small, poor, and insignificant. They had stripped me of my marital assets, frozen me out of their social circles, and tried to humiliate me into submission. They thought my geology career was a quaint hobby. They were about to find out that my science was the weapon that would dismantle their entire lives. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a fresh legal pad. It was time to map out the next phase of my retaliation. Vivian had promised to destroy my life, threatening to use her social influence to ruin my consulting career. Reginald was undoubtedly preparing a barrage of malicious legal filings to freeze my remaining meager assets and force the tax foreclosure. They were going to try and starve me out. They wanted to make me so desperate that I would surrender the deed just to survive. I needed to secure my ownership of the land against any legal maneuvers Reginald might try. More importantly, I needed to let them dig their own graves. I needed Sterling to confidently present his flawed development package to the tech executives. I needed him to publicly stake his company's reputation and financial stability on the acquisition of the lakefront property. The higher they climbed, the harder the fall would be when I pulled the geographical rug out from under them. I picked up my pen and wrote down a single name on the yellow paper. Reginald. The corrupt patriarch of the family would not wait for the tax deadline. He was too smart and too vicious for that. If intimidation and bribery did not work, he would turn to the courts. He would fabricate a reason to tie up my finances, ensuring I could not pay the county even if I managed to secure a loan. I needed to prepare my accounts and brace for impact. I ripped the page from the legal pad and pinned it to the corkboard beside my monitors. The bulldozer and Vivian's ridiculous bribe were just the opening skirmishes. The real battle was going to happen in boardrooms, in courtrooms, and in the harsh light of public opinion. I turned back to my keyboards, my fingers flying across the keys as I began preparing my geographical reports for the ultimate ambush. I was no longer fighting for survival. I was orchestrating an absolute financial slaughter. The fluorescent lights of the upscale Buckhead grocery store hummed relentlessly overhead, casting a sterile white glow over the aisles. I was navigating the polished floors with a carefully calculated list. My mind was still running complex simulations on geological strata, geothermal venting, and corporate property valuations. But my physical reality required immediate sustenance. I had spent the last 24 hours locked in my office plotting the absolute financial slaughter of my former family. Now I needed coffee-lean proteins and fresh produce to keep my stamina up for the impending war. I placed my modest selection of items onto the black conveyor belt. The cashier, a young man who looked entirely bored with his existence, scanned the groceries with agonizing slowness. Behind me, a line was beginning to form. A woman in a tailored Chanel blazer shifted her weight impatiently, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking against her shopping cart. It was the exact type of crowd Vivian associated with a crowd that fed on appearances and judged worth by zip codes. $84.12, the cashier mumbled, holding out his hand for payment. I pulled my sleek metal business debit card from my wallet and swiped it through the machine. The terminal processed the request for 2 seconds before emitting a sharp, unpleasant beep. The digital screen flashed bright red. Declined. I frowned, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. Try it again. The chip might be dirty. He wiped the card against his apron and inserted it directly into the slot. Another harsh beep echoed through the quiet checkout lane. Still declined, ma'am. The woman behind me sighed loudly, a dramatic exhale designed to let everyone know she was being inconvenienced. I ignored her. I pulled out my personal debit card, an account held by a completely different financial institution, and inserted the chip. Beep declined. A cold, creeping sensation washed over me, starting at the base of my skull and traveling down my spine. This was not a banking error. A single declined card was a glitch. 2 declined cards across different banks was a targeted strike. Ma'am, do you have another form of payment? The cashier asked, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of the surrounding lanes. Are you going to pay or not? I looked at the groceries, then at the growing line of irritated Buckhead elites staring at me. They were waiting for me to panic. They expected the flush of humiliation, the frantic searching through a purse for loose cash, the shameful stammering apology of a woman who could not afford her groceries. I gave them absolutely nothing. I calmly placed my debit cards back into my wallet, looked the cashier dead in the eye, and offered a terrifyingly serene smile. Keep the groceries. I have an urgent matter to attend to. I turned on my heel and walked out through the sliding glass doors, my head held high, my posture absolute iron. I did not rush. I did not look back. I drove straight from the grocery store to the downtown branch of my primary financial institution. I bypassed the tellers, ignored the receptionist, and walked directly into the glass-walled office of the branch manager. He was a man who had handled my consulting firm's accounts for the past 3 years. He looked up from his computer screens, his face instantly draining of color, as I walked through his door. Nia, he stammered, standing up so quickly, his heavy leather chair banged violently against the back wall. I was just about to call you. I am so sorry, but my hands are completely tied. Explain. I commanded, taking a seat across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. He nervously adjusted his tie, his hands trembling as he pulled a thick stack of legal documents from a manila file. We received a court order early this morning. A temporary emergency injunction freezing all of your assets. Both personal and business accounts are locked tight. The mandate came directly from Fulton County Superior Court. I snatched the paperwork from his desk. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, bypassing the standard boilerplates and hunting for the name of the plaintiff. There it was, printed in bold black ink. Reginald. My ex-father-in-law had not wasted a single second after Vivian's humiliating defeat at my property. Reginald was a terrifyingly corrupt corporate attorney who treated the legal system like his own personal weapon. He had filed an emergency motion accusing me of hiding and embezzling marital assets during our divorce proceedings. The motion claimed that my environmental consulting firm was nothing more than a shell company I had used to funnel Julian's money out of the marriage. It was an entirely fabricated, malicious lie. My business was built on my own grit and intellect long before Julian and I had ever exchanged vows. But in the hands of a connected attorney with deep pockets, a lie was just a tool. Reginald had bypassed standard family court procedures, pushing this emergency injunction straight to a judge he likely played golf with every Sunday at his exclusive country club. They froze everything, the branch manager whispered, looking genuinely terrified to even be holding the documents. You're checking your savings, your business operating capital. We cannot release a single dime until the injunction is lifted by a judge. And with the backlog in the family courts, getting a hearing to contest this could take weeks. Weeks! The timeline clicked perfectly into place inside my mind like the tumblers of a vault. The tax bill on the lakefront property was due in exactly 27 days. Reginald knew I needed liquid cash to pay the county and secure my deed. By freezing my accounts with a bogus marital asset claim, he was cutting off my oxygen supply. I stood up, dropping the useless legal papers back onto the manager's desk. "Thank you for your time," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I walked out of the bank and into the sweltering heat of the Atlanta afternoon. The pavement radiated heat, mirroring the boiling rage I kept locked tightly behind my ribcage. As I reached my car, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The caller ID displayed a blocked number, but I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. I answered on the second ring, lifting the phone to my ear but remaining totally silent. "I trust your trip to the grocery store was less than fruitful." Reginald's deep, gravelly voice echoed through the speaker. He sounded immensely pleased with himself, sitting in his leather-bound corner office, likely sipping a $200 glass of scotch. "You are committing perjury, Reginald," I stated, my tone conversational, as if we were discussing the humidity. "Filing a false injunction under penalty of law is a bold move even for a corrupt relic like you." He chuckled, a dark, rumbling sound that lacked any real warmth. "Perjury is a word used by people who cannot afford good lawyers, Naya. The law is not about truth. It is about leverage. And right now I have all of it. Julian told me about your little stunt with the sheriff yesterday. Vivian was quite displeased. I warned you during the divorce settlement not to make things difficult. You should have taken the $10,000 and walked away like a good little girl." "I prefer to stand my ground," I replied, unlocking my car door. "You are standing on quicksand," he countered, his voice dropping an octave, growing heavy with menace. "Your accounts are locked. You cannot buy food, you cannot buy gas, and you certainly cannot pay a $200,000 tax lien. Sterling's company has the municipal claim drafted and ready to execute the second the clock strikes midnight on the 30th day. You have 27 days until the county seizes your land and hands it directly to my son-in-law. You are starving, Nia, and the clock is ticking." "Are you finished?" I asked. "I am offering you one final exit," Reginald said, adopting a tone of fake magnanimity. "Sign the quitclaim deed. Hand the lakefront property over to Sterling by tomorrow morning. If you do, I will miraculously drop the injunction. Your accounts will unfreeze, and I will even write you a personal check for $50,000. Take the money and leave Atlanta. If you refuse, I will drag this court battle out until you are sleeping in your rusted car." I leaned against the hot metal of my driver's side door. They genuinely believed they had me cornered. They operated under the arrogant assumption that without immediate access to my local bank accounts, I was a helpless victim. Reginald's strategy was brutal, clinical, and flawlessly executed for a standard opponent. He was squeezing the vice grip, intending to watch me suffocate under the weight of the impending tax foreclosure. The in-laws were sitting in their mansions, clinking their crystal glasses, convinced they had successfully initiated the countdown to my absolute ruin. They thought they had cut off all my resources. They thought they knew exactly what I was capable of. "Reginald," I said softly, staring at the reflection of the Atlanta skyline in my car window. "I want you to remember this conversation. I want you to remember the exact moment you thought you had me beaten." I hung up the phone before he could respond. The pressure was undeniably mounting. The reality of having my primary financial arteries severed was a logistical nightmare. I had no cash on hand. My credit cards were dead plastic. The impending tax bill loomed over me like an executioner's axe. Without that $200,000, Sterling would legally seize the land, hand it to the tech conglomerate, and make the family billions while I walked away with nothing. But panic is the enemy of strategy. I slid into the driver's seat and turned the key in the ignition. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream in frustration or hit the steering wheel. Instead, I mentally reviewed the global banking architecture I had set up years ago precisely for a catastrophic scenario like this. Reginald's jurisdiction stopped at the United States border. His corrupt judges and malicious injunctions had zero power over international banking laws. He wanted to play a game of attrition. He wanted to starve me out and watch me fold under the stress of impending poverty. But a geologist knows that immense pressure does not just destroy, it forces elements to adapt, to crystallize, to become harder and sharper than anything surrounding them. I put the car in gear and pulled out into the heavy downtown traffic. Reginald had given me a 27-day deadline. It was more than enough time to bypass his petty local freeze and execute a master stroke that would leave his entire empire in ashes. By the time the sun rose the following morning, the humid air over the lake was already thick and oppressive. I was sitting at my makeshift desk with a mug of black coffee when my phone began to vibrate violently against the wooden tabletop. It was a relentless, unbroken rhythm of notifications. I did not expect Reginald to lift the freeze, but I also did not expect the sheer volume of alerts flooding my screen. It was not my bank. It was every social media platform I maintained for my consulting business. I swiped open my screen and was immediately assaulted by the perfectly contoured, tear-stained face of my former sister-in-law, Dominique. Dominique had built a massive following as an Atlanta lifestyle influencer. Her brand was built on projecting the illusion of a flawless, God-fearing high society life. She sold expensive wellness teas and posted daily devotionals from her immaculate Buckhead living room. This morning, however, her usual soft ring light was replaced by dim, dramatic shadows. She sat on her white boucle sofa, wearing an oversized cashmere sweater designed to make her look fragile and vulnerable. She was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, staring directly into the camera lens with a look of profound manufactured sorrow. I clicked play. The video was a masterclass in psychological manipulation and character assassination. Dominique spoke in a trembling whisper, telling her 2 million followers that her family was under attack. She painted a picture of Julian as a devoted, heartbroken man who had been emotionally abused and financially drained by a manipulative gold digger. She did not just imply things about me, she stated them as absolute facts. She claimed I had married Julian purely for his wealth, that I had refused to sign reasonable divorce papers, and that I was currently squatting on family property, attempting to extort her prominent, respected family for millions of dollars. She begged her followers to pray for her brother, claiming my toxic greed was tearing their close-knit family apart. It was a highly edited, brilliantly produced smear campaign. Dominique had spliced in out-of-context audio clips of me arguing with Julian during the bitterest days of our divorce. She had layered somber piano music beneath her monologue. The video was engineered to go viral, and it was working flawlessly. Within hours, it had spread across every major Black elite blog and gossip site in Atlanta. The comments section was a war zone of strangers calling me unhinged, demanding I leave the prominent family alone, and attacking my professional credibility. My phone vibrated again in my palm. This time, it was a direct call from Marcus Thorne, the vice president of a major agricultural firm that provided over 40% of my consulting revenue. I answered the call, keeping my breathing slow and measured. Marcus did not waste time with pleasantries. He sounded deeply uncomfortable, clearing his throat several times before delivering the blow. The firm's board of directors had seen the video. They were a company heavily reliant on public goodwill and government contracts, and they could not risk being associated with a viral PR nightmare. They were suspending my consulting contract indefinitely, effective immediately. Less than 20 minutes later, an email arrived from my second-largest client, a regional water management board. The message was legally sterile and brutally brief. Due to unforeseen circumstances and a shift in corporate direction, they were terminating our agreement. The in-laws were not just trying to starve me out by freezing my bank accounts. They were systematically destroying my ability to earn a living in the city of Atlanta. They wanted to ensure that even if I managed to slip out of Reginald's legal trap, I would have no professional reputation left to fall back on. Julian sent a text message right as I finished reading the termination email. It contained only 5 words: "Last chance to sign Nia." They honestly believed they had me completely surrounded. They thought that stripping away my income, destroying my reputation, and weaponizing their social influence would finally break my spirit. A lesser woman would have recorded a frantic response video. A lesser woman would have gone online crying and screaming about the injustice, trying desperately to defend her character to an audience of strangers who had already made up their minds. But I am a scientist. I do not deal in public relations or social media theatrics. I deal in bedrock, structural integrity, and undeniable facts. Let Dominique have her viral moment. Let Julian gloat. I did not need public sympathy to win this war. I just needed land. I turned off my cell phone, tossing it onto the sofa. I walked back to my secure custom-built desktop array and woke up the monitors. Reginald had successfully locked down every account tied to my name and my consulting firm within the United States. He was a powerful man in Fulton County, but his reach had absolute limits. He could not touch what he did not know existed. Years before I ever met Julian, before I was pulled into the toxic orbit of his family's wealth, I had developed a proprietary soil testing methodology. I sold the licensing rights to a European agricultural conglomerate. Recognizing the unpredictable nature of my freelance consulting career, I had taken the entire payout and established a secure blind trust in the Isle of Man. It was a completely legal, impenetrable offshore account that existed entirely outside of American probate court jurisdictions. I had never mentioned it to Julian during our marriage. I had never linked it to our joint finances. It was my ultimate safety net sitting quietly across the Atlantic Ocean, accumulating interest and waiting for a rainy day. Today was a torrential downpour. I accessed the encrypted portal, inputting my biometric keys and complex passwords. The account balance glowed on the screen, completely untouched by Reginald's malicious injunction. I had liquid capital, and I knew exactly how to use it. I pulled up the county parcel maps on my center monitor, overlaying them with the geological surveys of the geothermal aquifer. Sterling was a ruthless developer, but he was also arrogant and sloppy. He looked at land through the lens of a spreadsheet, not a microscope. His shell companies had been aggressively purchasing the pristine buildable lots surrounding my cabin. He was assembling a massive, picturesque real estate package to present to the global tech conglomerate. But in his rush to secure the attractive land, he had made a fatal geographical oversight. Bordering my property to the east and south were three narrow, irregularly shaped lots. They were ugly, severely sloped, and classified by the county as high-risk flood zones. The topsoil there was even more acidic than my own, a literal toxic mud pit where nothing would grow. Sterling had completely ignored them. To a real estate developer looking to build access roads and infrastructure, those muddy lots were an expensive liability. Why waste his borrowed bridge loan capital on unbuildable sludge when he could just buy the solid ground? He had assumed those lots would sit empty forever. He had assumed nobody would ever be foolish enough to buy them. But Sterling did not understand the geothermal venting structure of the aquifer below. Those three muddy lots did not just border my property. They formed a perfect unbroken horseshoe around the only viable drilling access point. If someone else owned those three lots, Sterling could not build a single access road, run a single power line, or lay a single cooling pipe to reach my central property. He would be completely geographically landlocked. I opened a new tab and accessed the online portal for the Wyoming Secretary of State. Wyoming offered some of the strongest corporate privacy laws in the country. Within 15 minutes, I had registered a new anonymous shell corporation. I named it Obsidian Lithos LLC. It was untraceable to my name, shielded by registered agents and ironclad privacy statutes. I initiated a wire transfer from my offshore trust directly into the newly formed LLC's operating account. The funds cleared almost instantly. Next, I navigated to the county's commercial real estate portal. The three muddy lots were listed for public sale by the city, priced at absolute rock bottom due to their unbuildable classification. They were practically giving them away. I filled out the digital acquisition forms under the name of Obsidian Lithos LLC. I bypassed the standard financing options and selected direct cash purchase. I paid the asking price in full, adding a 20% premium to expedite the municipal processing and close the sale immediately. I hit submit and watched the progress bar load across my screen. The transaction processed, the municipal seals were digitally stamped, and the receipts were generated. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the updated parcel map on my monitor. The 3 dead, muddy lots surrounding my cabin were no longer public land. They belonged to me. I had just erected an invisible, impenetrable fortress around the exact geographical epicenter of the geothermal aquifer. Sterling could buy all the beautiful solid land he wanted. He could secure all the bridge loans in Atlanta, but without crossing my newly acquired mud pits, his development firm could not physically reach the cooling source the tech company required. Dominique was busy shedding fake tears on the internet, destroying my public image to appease her husband and her brother. They were all celebrating my impending ruin, convinced they had starved me out of the game. They had absolutely no idea that while they were playing a high school popularity contest online, I had just quietly purchased the lock, the key, and the gate to their billion-dollar future. I saved the digital deeds to my encrypted hard drive and closed the browser. Let them laugh. Let them spread their rumors and freeze my empty local accounts. In a few days, Sterling was going to walk into a boardroom to pitch the deal of a lifetime, entirely unaware that he was walking straight into a slaughterhouse. The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Four Seasons was a masterclass in excessive, suffocating wealth. The annual Autumn Charity Gala was the crowning event of the season for the city's black elite, a glittering playground where fortunes were flaunted and social hierarchies were ruthlessly enforced. Towering floral centerpieces of white orchids and rare black calla lilies dominated the silk-draped tables. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the sea of custom tuxedos and designer couture. This was Vivian's kingdom. She sat on the charity's board of directors, reigning over the guest list with an iron fist to ensure only the most prominent, influential families were allowed past the velvet ropes. I stepped into the ballroom exactly 1 hour after the doors opened. I did not slink in through the back corridors or try to blend into the shadows. I walked directly down the center aisle of the grand marble staircase. I was wearing a breathtaking, custom-tailored emerald silk gown that cascaded down my frame like liquid glass. The deep green fabric highlighted the rich undertones of my skin, and the sharp, asymmetrical neckline projected absolute power. I wore no jewelry, letting the dress and my sheer confidence make the statement. I was a far cry from the feral, unhinged swamp creature Dominique had painted me as in her viral video. The reaction was instantaneous. The clinking of champagne flutes stopped. The low murmur of wealthy networking ground to a halt. Heads turned and a heavy, suffocating silence rippled across the massive room. I could feel hundreds of eyes tracking my every movement, instantly recognizing me from the tear-stained smear campaign that had saturated their social media feeds over the last 48 hours. I kept my chin high and my steps measured, gliding across the polished floor with the absolute certainty of an apex predator stepping into a cage of frantic birds. Vivian intercepted me before I even reached the main dining floor. She was flanked immediately by Dominique, who looked like she was vibrating with a mix of fury and excitement. Vivian wore a severe black velvet gown, her face twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic rage. Dominique had her smartphone clutched tightly in her manicured hand, her thumb hovering over the record button, practically begging me to do something reactive she could post online. "What are you doing here?" Vivian hissed, keeping her voice low so it would not echo, but infusing every syllable with pure venom. "This is a private, ticketed charity event for respected members of the community. It is not a soup kitchen, Nia. I am fully aware of what kind of event this is." "Vivian," I replied smoothly, not breaking my stride until I was standing inches from her face. "And I am here to enjoy the evening." "You are insane!" Dominique spat, stepping forward to block my path. "After what you did to my brother, after trying to extort us, you actually have the nerve to show your face in public. You are a gold-digging sociopath. I should go live right now and let everyone see you trespassing." Vivian raised her hand, silencing her daughter, and signaled 2 heavily muscled security guards standing near the ballroom entrance. "You are not on the guest list, Nia. You have humiliated this family enough. Escort her out." Vivian commanded the guards as they approached. "She is trespassing." The larger of the two guards reached for my arm. I did not flinch. Instead, I smoothly pulled a heavy gold-embossed envelope from my small clutch and handed it directly to the floor manager, who had jogged over to manage the commotion. "I believe you will find my presence is fully accounted for," I stated clearly, my voice carrying just enough for the surrounding tables to hear. The manager opened the envelope, scanned the heavy cardstock, and immediately paled. "Mrs. Vivian," he stammered, looking terrified to contradict the board member. "She has a ticket, a platinum-level sponsor ticket. It was purchased under the corporate name Obsidian Lithos LLC." Vivian's eyes narrowed into deadly slits. She did not know what Obsidian Lithos was, but she knew what a platinum sponsorship cost. It was a $25,000 table. Her mind was undoubtedly racing, trying to figure out how a woman with completely frozen bank accounts had managed to secure a premium seat at her exclusive gala. She could not legally throw out a platinum sponsor without causing a massive scene and risking the charity's funding. "Fine," Vivian snarled, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive gin on her breath. "You bought a ticket with whatever pennies you managed to hide from the courts. But I am still on the board of this charity, and I control the seating chart." She snapped her fingers at the floor manager. "Put her at table 30, and make sure she stays there." The floor manager looked apologetic as he guided me away from the pristine center of the ballroom. Table 30 was not just in the back. It was shoved into a dark, drafty alcove directly next to the swinging metal doors of the main kitchen. Waiters rushed past in a frantic blur, carrying massive trays of food. The loud crash of industrial dishwashers and the shouting of the culinary staff completely drowned out the elegant string quartet playing on the main stage. It was the ultimate social insult, a petty display of power designed to make me feel isolated, insignificant, and humiliated. I sat down at the empty table, gracefully arranging the folds of my emerald gown. I picked up my crystal water glass and took a sip, watching the glittering crowd from the shadows. Vivian thought she had put me in my place. She thought she was punishing me. But from my vantage point by the kitchen, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire ballroom. I could see every player on the board. It did not take long for the next wave of the attack to arrive. Julian came strolling through the tables wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo and a smile dripping with unearned arrogance. Clinging tightly to his arm was a stunning, incredibly young woman dripping in Cartier diamonds. She had the polished, empty look of a woman who had never worked a day in her life, fully funded by a massive family trust. This was the new wealthy fiancé Dominique had relentlessly praised online. Julian stopped right in front of my table, deliberately blocking my view of the stage. He looked around the noisy, cramped alcove and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Table 30. Julian sneered, shaking his head. "Right next to the garbage disposal. I suppose my mother is finally putting things exactly where they belong." The young woman giggled, a high, irritating sound, and leaned closer to Julian. "Is this her baby?" she asked, looking down at me as if I were an exhibit at a zoo. "The one your sister warned everyone about? She does not look very dangerous, just desperate." "She is desperate, Penelope." "That is what happens when you try to fight out of your weight class," Julian said. He leaned his hands on my table, bringing his face down to my level. The smell of his expensive cologne made my stomach turn. "I hear you had some trouble at the grocery store this week, Nia. Reginald told me the bank froze every single dime you have. Not so arrogant now, are you? You cannot even buy a loaf of bread, let alone fight a legal war against my family." I remained perfectly still, resting my hands in my lap. I did not give him the satisfaction of looking away or showing a single trace of anger. "You should have taken the deal," Julian whispered, his eyes gleaming with malicious joy. "You should have taken the $10,000 and signed over the swamp. Now the courts have your accounts locked tight, and that tax bill is due in a few weeks. You are completely out of options. Sterling is going to seize that land, and by the end of the month, you are going to be homeless. You will be living on the street, and my family will not lift a single finger to help you. You really should just give up," Penelope added, adjusting a massive diamond ring on her left hand. "Julian is being too nice. If you sign the papers now, maybe they will give you enough bus fare to leave Atlanta. It is honestly embarrassing watching you drag this out." I let the noise of the kitchen crash behind me for a long moment before I finally spoke. My voice was calm, steady, and razor-sharp. "You look beautiful tonight, Penelope," I said, directing my gaze entirely to the young woman. "I see Julian is already spending the money he thinks he is going to make off my property." Julian bristled, his face reddening instantly. "I do not need your property to buy my fiancé diamonds, Nia. I am a partner at a top-tier logistics firm. You are a glorified middleman living off your mother's trust fund." I corrected him smoothly, shifting my eyes back to his. "And you are currently counting on your brother-in-law to close a real estate deal that you physically cannot execute. You think freezing my bank accounts is a victory? You think Reginald's little legal injunction means you have won? It means you are ruined," Julian snapped, dropping his sophisticated facade. "You have nothing. You are nothing. Enjoy your dinner by the kitchen doors, Nia. It is the last expensive meal you will ever have." I smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of my lips that made Julian instinctively step back from the table. "I am perfectly comfortable right here, Julian. Because unlike you, I know exactly what is buried underneath the dirt. You go ahead and enjoy the gala. Dance, drink champagne, and celebrate your imaginary victory. Because when the music stops, you are going to realize you built your entire future on a foundation that I already own." Julian scoffed, shaking his head as if dealing with a delusional patient. "You have lost your mind. Come on, Penelope, the smell of the kitchen is ruining my appetite." They turned and walked back toward the glittering center of the ballroom, laughing together as they joined Vivian and Dominique at the head table. I watched them go, completely unbothered by the noise, the draft, or the social isolation. Julian thought he was watching a woman drowning. He had no idea he was standing in the middle of a trap that was already snapping shut. The clinking of silverware and the low hum of affluent networking slowly faded as the string quartet brought their performance to a graceful close. A heavy, expectant hush settled over the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons. From my isolated vantage point at table 30, shadowed by the relentless swinging doors of the kitchen, I watched the floor manager hurry toward the main stage. He tapped the microphone twice, the sharp thumps echoing off the crystal chandeliers, and announced the evening's keynote speaker. Sterling strode up the marble steps to the podium, radiating the aggressive confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. He was dressed impeccably in a midnight blue tuxedo, his posture straight, his smile a practiced weapon of corporate charm. This was the moment he had been waiting for. This was his coronation. In the front row, bathed in the soft glow of the stage lights, Reginald sat like a proud, corrupt kingmaker. He leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of amber liquid. His eyes locked on his son-in-law, with vicious approval. Vivian sat beside him, her hands clasped elegantly in her lap, while Dominique held her phone high, live streaming the entire event to her millions of followers. They were a portrait of untouchable power, absolutely certain that their enemies were vanquished and their legacy was secure. "Thank you, Atlanta." Sterling began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system, smooth and perfectly modulated. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate charity, community, and the future of our great city. But tonight, I am not just here to ask for your generous donations. I am here to share a vision. A vision that will fundamentally change the economic landscape of the Southeast for generations to come." A ripple of excited murmurs washed through the crowd. Men in expensive suits leaned forward. Women adorned in diamonds stopped whispering. Sterling had them in the palm of his hand. "For the past 6 months, my development firm has been working tirelessly behind closed doors." Sterling continued, gripping the edges of the podium. "We recognized that the future of industry relies on sustainable, eco-friendly infrastructure. We recognized that Atlanta is uniquely positioned to lead that charge. And tonight, I am incredibly proud to announce that our firm has officially signed a memorandum of understanding with one of the top 5 global technology conglomerates in the world." The ballroom erupted into spontaneous applause. Reginald nodded slowly, tapping his glass. Sterling held up a hand, expertly playing the crowd, waiting for the noise to die down before delivering the final devastating blow. "This conglomerate is preparing to build a $1 billion carbon-neutral data center," Sterling announced, his voice rising with triumphant energy. and I am thrilled to publicly declare that we have successfully secured the primary Lake Lanier real estate required for this massive undertaking. We have locked down the necessary acreage to implement a revolutionary closed-loop geothermal cooling system. This project will bring thousands of high-paying tech jobs to our community. It will pump billions of dollars into our local economy. And it will cement our city and my family's firm as the undisputed leaders of the modern technological revolution. The crowd did not just applaud, they rose to their feet. A roaring standing ovation consumed the ballroom. Wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites clapped until their hands turned red. Vivian wiped a single elegant tear from her cheek. Dominique panned her camera across the cheering room, capturing the exact moment her family achieved absolute, untouchable supremacy. Julian stood near the back, grinning like a hyena, lifting his champagne flute in a mocking toast toward my dark, isolated corner. They had done it. They had publicly staked their entire reputation, their corporate valuation, and their financial future on the Lake Lanier project. Sterling had stood in front of the most powerful people in the state and promised them a billion-dollar miracle. From the shadows of the kitchen doors, I sat perfectly still in my emerald gown. I picked up my crystal glass and took a slow, deliberate sip of sparkling water. The cool liquid slid down my throat, grounding me in the chaotic noise of the room. I did not scream. I did not leap out of my chair and object to his lies. I did not run to the stage and demand to be heard. I simply watched the spectacle with the cold, detached fascination of a scientist observing a chemical reaction that was about to go critically critical. Sterling was committing corporate suicide on a public stage. A memorandum of understanding was a formal agreement, a binding preliminary contract that required total transparency and absolute proof of assets. By publicly declaring he had secured the primary real estate, he had legally tethered his firm to a promise he could not fulfill. He had promised the tech conglomerate an open door. He had absolutely no idea that I had already changed the locks, boarded up the windows, and bought the ground beneath the welcome mat. He owned the dry land. He owned the beautiful buildable acreage. But beneath the surface, beneath the manicured topsoil he had purchased with millions in leveraged bridge loans, the geology told a completely different story. The geothermal aquifer, the massive subterranean lake that made the entire billion-dollar project possible, was shielded by impenetrable granite everywhere except directly beneath my cabin. And the only way to lay the cooling pipes, the only way to run the heavy industrial equipment to my central property, was to cross the three sloped toxic muddy flood zones that formed a perfect horseshoe around my land. Those lots were worthless to a real estate developer. But to a geologist, they were the ultimate choke point. And as of yesterday afternoon, those three muddy lots belonged entirely to Obsidian Lithos, LLC. They belonged to me. Sterling was completely landlocked. He could not move a single bulldozer. He could not lay a single inch of pipeline. He had just sold a billion-dollar dream to a global tech giant, and he did not actually own the access rights to make it happen. He had leveraged his family's money, Reginald's legal reputation, and his own corporate standing on a deal that was geographically impossible without my signature. The applause began to fade as guests returned to their seats, their faces flushed with the excitement of impending wealth. The string quartet readied their instruments to resume playing. The gala was shifting into an atmosphere of jubilant celebration. I set my water glass down on the white tablecloth. The moisture left a perfect temporary ring on the fabric. I reached into my small silk clutch and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim lighting of the alcove. I bypassed the local network and connected to my secure encrypted server. I did not need to fight Vivian's social media smear campaign. I did not need to convince the local agricultural boards that I was innocent of Reginald's fabricated marital asset charges. I only needed to speak to the people who were currently holding Sterling's billion-dollar check. During my tenure consulting for the European agricultural conglomerate, I had cross-referenced environmental compliance reports for dozens of major international corporations. I knew exactly who handled land acquisitions for the tech giant Sterling was currently bragging about. I knew the name, the direct email address, and the private cellular number of their lead infrastructure executive, a man notorious for his ruthless due diligence and absolute zero-tolerance policy for corporate fraud. I opened a secure, untraceable messaging application. I attached a single compressed file. Inside that file were 3 documents. First, the high-resolution geological thermal scan, proving that the only access point to the Lake Lanier aquifer sat squarely beneath my cabin. Second, the certified time-stamped deeds for the 3 surrounding flood zone lots, legally registered to Obsidian Lithos LLC. Third, a clean, irrefutable geological overlay demonstrating that any attempt to drill from Sterling's newly acquired acreage would hit solid granite and instantly fail. I typed a very brief, highly professional message to accompany the data. To the lead acquisition director, regarding your Lake Lanier geothermal project memorandum of understanding with Sterling Development. Please review the attached geological surveys and municipal deed transfers. The vendor you are currently contracting with does not possess the land rights or the geological access required to execute the cooling infrastructure. They are completely landlocked. The primary access point and the necessary surrounding buffer zones are privately held and are currently not for sale. I advise you to review your partner's compliance claims immediately. I stared at the glowing blue send button for a fraction of a second. This was the point of no return. This was the moment the earth would open up and swallow Reginald's empire whole. I tapped the screen. The message vanished into the digital ether, rocketing across the country directly into the pocket of the most powerful tech executive in the hemisphere. I slipped the phone back into my clutch and snapped the gold clasp shut. The sharp click was barely audible over the roaring industrial dishwashers behind me, but to my ears, it sounded like a judge bringing down a gavel. I stood up from table 30. The emerald silk of my gown swept against the floor as I stepped out of the shadows. I did not glance toward the head table. I did not look at Julian, Vivian, or Dominique. They were already ghosts clinging to a reality that I had just annihilated with a single text message. A terrifying cold smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a woman who had been dragged through the mud, only to realize the mud was exactly where she held all the power. I walked confidently toward the heavy wooden exit doors of the grand ballroom. My heels clicked a steady, rhythmic cadence against the marble floor of the lobby, leaving the suffocating heat of the gala behind me. I stepped out into the cool, crisp Atlanta night air, breathing in the scent of exhaust and concrete. The war was no longer being fought on their terms. The ground had officially shifted, and the avalanche was already rushing down the mountain. The crisp night air outside the Four Seasons felt like absolute freedom, but my mind was already replaying the exact moment I had secured their destruction. To understand the sheer magnitude of Sterling's catastrophic miscalculation tonight, you have to rewind the clock. 3 days prior, the narrative was entirely different. It was a rainy Tuesday evening. I was sitting inside a rented nondescript gray sedan, parked discreetly across the street from the Oak Room, an ultra-exclusive members-only cigar lounge in the heart of Buckhead. Rain lashed against the windshield, distorting the glowing neon signs of the street, while the interior of my car was bathed in the harsh, sterile light of my laptop screen. I wore a pair of heavy noise-canceling headphones, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, my breathing slow and completely controlled. Through the Isle of Man trust, I had bypassed Reginald's financial chokehold and hired Vance. Vance was not a standard private investigator who chased cheating spouses or snapped blurry photos through motel windows. He was a former federal agent specializing in corporate espionage and white-collar crime. He cost $2,000 a day, and he was currently sitting in a plush leather wingback chair less than 20 feet away from my soon-to-be ex-husband. Vance was wearing a custom-tailored suit, equipped with a microscopic military-grade directional microphone disguised as a lapel pin. The audio feed was transmitting live, bouncing through 2 encrypted relays before streaming directly into my recording software. The audio quality was terrifyingly crisp. I could hear the low hum of jazz music, the strike of a heavy brass lighter, and the sharp clink of ice cubes against crystal tumblers. Then Julian's voice drifted through my headphones, slightly slurred and dripping with his trademark unearned arrogance. I am telling you, Sterling, you worry entirely too much. The Scotch poured a liquid splash over ice. Drink your Macallan and celebrate. We are standing on the edge of a billion-dollar empire. Sterling did not sound like a man ready to celebrate. His voice was tight-clipped, vibrating with poorly concealed anxiety. We are cutting it too close, Julian. The tech conglomerate is demanding absolute proof of site control by Thursday afternoon. They will not even look at the Memorandum of Understanding without verifying that we own the entire central footprint. And we cannot show them site control without the $10 million commercial bridge loan from the bank. Sterling paused, and I could hear the heavy exhalation of cigar smoke. The bank will not clear the $10 million without your wife's property listed as secure collateral. Reginald's legal freeze is a nice parlor trick, Julian, but it does not transfer the title. She is still sitting in that cabin, and she is still the sole legal owner of the land. We are paralyzed until she signs that quitclaim deed. If she holds out past Thursday, the tech guys will pull the deal and go to Texas. Julian laughed. It was a dark, ugly sound that made my skin crawl even from across the street. It was the laugh of a man who had never faced a single genuine consequence in his entire privileged life. She does not need to sign it, Sterling Julian said smoothly. There was a long, heavy silence on the audio feed. The background jazz music seemed to swell to fill the void. What exactly do you mean by that? Sterling asked, his voice dropping an octave, instantly wary. I mean, I already handled it, Julian replied, the smugness radiating through the microphone. I knew Nia was going to be a stubborn, self-righteous problem. She thinks she is so much smarter than everyone else because she has a couple of science degrees. She thinks she can play hardball with my family. So I took the liberty of accelerating the timeline. Julian leaned closer to Sterling. I could hear the leather of the armchair creaking as he shifted his weight. You know, Marcus Vance. Not the P. The notary public, who works out of the Fulton County Records Office. He owes my father a massive favor from a DU. I charge a few years back that Reginald quietly made disappear. Marcus has a very flexible moral compass when it comes to repaying his debts. Sterling's breathing hitched on the audio feed. Julian, tell me you did not do what I think you did. I did exactly what needed to be done to secure our family's future. Julian snapped back, his tone turning defensive and harsh. I printed the standard quitclaim deed transferring ownership of Nia's cabin and the surrounding acreage directly to your development firm. I forged her signature on the bottom line. It was remarkably easy to copy from our old joint tax returns. I took it to Marcus this morning. He stamped it, logged it into the county electronic registry, and officially authenticated it. As far as the state of Georgia is concerned, Nia happily signed over her property today at noon. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I sat frozen in the damp chill of the rental car, processing the sheer magnitude of what Julian had just confessed to. He had not just crossed a moral line, he had sprinted across a massive legal boundary. Are you out of your mind? Sterling hissed, his voice a frantic, panicked whisper. Do you have any idea what you have just done? That is forgery. That is fraud. If the bank finds out we are using a falsified deed to secure a $10 million commercial loan, we are looking at federal bank fraud. That is 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Julian, the FBI does not care who your father is. They are not going to find out, Julian shot back aggressively. Lower your voice and listen to me. The bank is going to see a perfectly authenticated, stamped and registered county deed. They are going to approve the bridge loan tomorrow. You are going to take that $10 million and show the tech conglomerate that you have total site control and deep liquidity. You sign the memorandum on Friday at the gala. We lock in the billion-dollar contract. Sterling took a ragged breath. And what happens when Nia realizes her property has been stolen? What happens when she goes to the police? Julian let out another sharp, dismissive laugh. Let her go to the police. Let her scream and cry to anyone who will listen. By the time she realizes the land has been transferred, we will have secured the billion-dollar tech contract. We will have unlimited capital. If she tries to sue us, Reginald will bury her in so much expensive corporate litigation she will spend the rest of her life in court. We already froze her bank accounts. She has no money to hire a lawyer to fight a forged deed. It is her word against a county-registered document and an authenticated notary stamp. Who are they going to believe, a broke, disgruntled ex-wife, or a prominent Atlanta family finalizing the biggest real estate deal in state history? I listened as the reality of the situation washed over Sterling. I could hear the internal battle playing out in his silence. The terrifying risk of federal prison warring against the blinding, intoxicating allure of a billion-dollar payout. Greed is a highly predictable element. Under the right pressure, it always overcomes logic. You are absolutely certain Marcus will keep his mouth shut? Sterling finally asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and dark excitement. Marcus likes his freedom, Julian replied smoothly. He will not say a word. The deed is processed. The land is yours. Take the win, Sterling. We beat her. I reached over to my laptop keyboard and pressed the stop button on the recording software. The audio feed cut out, plunging my car back into the quiet rhythm of the falling rain. I stared at the glowing digital file sitting on my desktop. They thought they had beaten me. They thought stripping away my consulting contracts and locking me out of my local checking accounts had rendered me defenseless. Julian had operated under the fatal assumption that I was a weak, emotional woman who would simply fold under pressure. He failed to realize that I was a scientist. I did not operate on emotion. I operated on empirical evidence. And Julian had just handed me the most devastating piece of evidence imaginable. Forging a signature on a county real estate document was a state-level felony. Conspiring with a corrupt government official to register that forged document elevated the crime significantly. But using that forged deed to intentionally deceive a federally insured bank in order to secure a $10 million commercial bridge loan crossed the threshold into federal bank fraud and wire fraud. Julian had just guaranteed himself, the notary and Sterling, a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. I did not waste a single second. I opened my encryption software and ran the high-definition audio file through a proprietary scrambling algorithm, locking it behind a biometric firewall. Once the file was secured, I began the backup protocol. I uploaded the encrypted audio to my blind trust servers on the Isle of Man. I bounced a redundant copy to a secure data vault in Switzerland. I transferred a third copy to a physical encrypted flash drive that I immediately slipped into the hidden compartment of my car console. I sat back against the driver's seat, listening to the rain beat against the roof of the sedan. A cold, terrifying sense of clarity washed over me. I had everything I needed to destroy them. I held the smoking gun, the bullets, and the matches. But I was not going to hand this audio over to the authorities just yet. If I went to the police on Tuesday night, they would arrest Julian for forgery, and the tech deal would quietly dissolve before Sterling ever had the chance to sign his name to the contract. That was too easy. That was too clean. I did not just want to stop their real estate deal. I wanted them to experience the exact same public humiliation, absolute financial ruin, and total destruction they had so happily planned for me. I wanted Sterling to stand on a stage in front of the entire city and publicly tie his firm, his reputation, and his personal liberty to a fraudulent loan and a stolen piece of land. I wanted the tech conglomerate to see the absolute corruption of the family they were dealing with. I wanted Vivian and Dominique to watch their precious, untouchable empire burn to the ground on live television. I put the car in gear and pulled out into the heavy Atlanta traffic, leaving the glow of the cigar lounge in my rearview mirror. Julian and Sterling were inside, drinking expensive scotch, toasting to my impending homelessness. They had no idea that they had just poured gasoline over their own lives and handed me the detonator. That was 3 days ago. And now, walking out of the Four Seasons into the crisp autumn night, the echo of Sterling's arrogant speech still ringing in my ears, I knew the trap was finally set. The memorandum was signed. The bridge loan was cleared. The wire fraud was officially complete. The countdown had begun, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. Reginald stared at the deeds on the table. His aristocratic face had turned an ashen, sickly shade of gray. The legal ramifications of the trap were rapidly clicking into place in his highly trained mind. "You promised this man a billion-dollar development," I said, gesturing toward the furious CEO. "You signed a binding memorandum claiming you had site control, but you own an island of granite, And I own the ocean surrounding it. Your entire pitch is a geographical impossibility. Sterling staggered back from the table as if the maps had physically burned him. He bumped into Julian, who was staring at the black horseshoe on the paper with blank, uncomprehending eyes. The sheer, overwhelming reality of their failure was suffocating them. They had spent millions, they had leveraged their entire corporate structure, and they had absolutely nothing to show for it. But the geographical trap was only the beginning. The real destruction, the absolute annihilation of their family, was still sitting safely in my briefcase. The boardroom of the tech conglomerate's regional headquarters was a fortress of glass steel and suffocating tension. Hovering 50 stories above the Atlanta skyline, the room was designed to facilitate the rapid exchange of staggering amounts of capital. The polished mahogany table stretched across the center of the space like a runway. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy glass doors glided open. Reginald led the charge, stepping into the room with the slow, deliberate stride of a conqueror claiming his territory. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit with a crimson silk tie, his posture radiating absolute authority. Sterling followed closely behind him, clutching a thick leather portfolio containing the final acquisition contracts. The documents inside were designed to legally transfer $100 million into his development firm's holding accounts before the end of the business day. Julian brought up the rear, checking his reflection in the glass walls, a smug and relaxed smile plastered across his face. They took their seats on one side of the mahogany table, spreading out their documents and expensive fountain pens. Julian leaned back and crossed his legs, joking about how flawlessly the weekend had gone. He bragged that the bank had already authorized the $10 million bridge loan. Sterling nodded eagerly, confirming that the funds were actively sitting in their operating account, providing the exact proof of liquidity the tech conglomerate required. Reginald smiled, a cold, predatory curving of his lips, praising his son-in-law for executing the play perfectly. They honestly believed they were untouchable. They were completely oblivious to the digital guillotine suspended directly above their necks. At 9:15, the heavy double doors at the far end of the boardroom swung open. Sterling immediately stood up, buttoning his suit jacket and extending his hand, ready to deliver his practiced, charismatic pitch. The greeting died in his throat. The CEO of the tech conglomerate did not walk into the room with a smile. He strode through the doorway with a face like thunder. His jaw was locked tight, his eyes burning with a cold, contained fury that instantly sucked the oxygen out of the massive room. He did not extend his hand. He walked directly to the head of the table and stood there, gripping the back of his leather chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. But it was not the CEO's fury that caused Reginald to freeze. It was the people walking in directly behind him. I stepped into the boardroom. I was not wearing an emerald silk gown or playing the part of the gracious, quiet wife. I wore a razor-sharp tailored black blazer and a matching skirt, my hair pulled back tightly, my expression completely devoid of emotion. I carried a sleek black leather briefcase in my right hand. Flanking me on either side were two men in dark, severe suits. They were not local Atlanta attorneys. They were federal real estate litigators from a ruthless Washington firm specialist in uncovering massive corporate fraud, and they looked at Julian and Sterling like wolves analyzing injured prey. The silence in the room was absolute and heavy. Sterling's hand dropped slowly to his side. Julian's smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending shock. Reginald was the first to recover his voice, his aristocratic composure cracking as his face flushed with sudden, violent anger. "What is the meaning of this?" Reginald demanded, slamming his palm flat against the mahogany table. He glared at the CEO, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "This woman has no business being on this floor. She is a disgruntled, mentally unstable ex-wife who is currently under a legal injunction. I demand that you have security escort her out of this building immediately, or I will consider this a breach of our negotiations and I will sue this conglomerate for every dime of this contract." The CEO did not blink. He did not look at Reginald. He kept his eyes locked dead on Sterling. "I suggest you sit down and close your mouth." "Reginald," the CEO said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper, because if even 10% of what this woman has shown me is true, a lawsuit is the absolute least of your family's problems today. Julian shot up from his chair, his panic manifesting as aggressive bluster. "This is absurd," Julian shouted, pointing at me. "She is lying to you. Whatever she sent you, whatever she said, it is a desperate fabrication. She is broke. Her accounts are frozen. She is just trying to sabotage my family because she is bitter about the divorce. Call security and throw her out before she ruins this deal." I did not wait for the CEO to respond. I stepped forward, bypassing the posturing men completely, and walked directly to the center of the mahogany table. I laid my leather briefcase flat on the polished wood. I flicked the twin brass latches. The sharp metallic clicks echoed through the boardroom like gunshots. "I am not here to ruin your deal, Julian," I stated, my voice echoing clearly off the glass walls. "I am here to explain the geography of your impending bankruptcy." I reached into the briefcase and pulled out a dense spiral-bound technical report, dropping it onto the mahogany surface with a heavy thud. "You did not just buy useless land, Sterling," I said, my voice cutting through the thick silence of the boardroom like a scalpel. "You bought a ticking geological time bomb." I opened the report and turned the binder to face the CEO. The pages were filled with complex seismic wave readouts and subterranean density charts. The acreage Sterling's development firm acquired is situated directly over the linear subfault, I explained, maintaining a cold academic precision. The topsoil looks perfectly viable to a layman. But 40 feet below the surface, the limestone bedrock is highly porous and actively dissolving. It is a massive, naturally occurring sinkhole waiting to happen. If you were to construct a 1,000,000-square-foot data center on that specific footprint, the sheer physical weight of the concrete and steel would inevitably fracture the compromised limestone crust. Sterling wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. His breathing was shallow and erratic. "That is a lie," he stammered, his voice cracking. "We had surveyors out there. We had engineers look at the plots." "You hired commercial contractors who took core samples at 20 feet, I corrected him smoothly. "I am a structural geoscientist. I took my scans at 200 feet. If your tech conglomerate builds their server farms on Sterling's land, the immense heat generated by the hardware combined with the unstable fault line and the complete lack of geothermal venting will cause the subterranean moisture to boil and expand. Within 36 months, the bedrock will buckle. The ground will literally swallow your billion-dollar facility whole." The CEO leaned forward, his hands planted firmly on the table. He stared at the seismic charts, his jaw locked in a furious grind. He did not need a science degree to understand the bright red danger zones radiating across Sterling's acquired parcels. He slowly turned his head to look at Sterling. The look in his eyes was lethal. "Is this true?" the CEO demanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "Did you leverage my company's resources to build on a sinkhole?" Sterling opened his mouth, but his throat seized. He looked frantically at Reginald for help, but Reginald was staring blankly at the maps, completely paralyzed by the sudden collapse of his grand design. He did not know I answered for him, allowing a sharp edge of condescension to enter my tone. "Sterling operates on hubris, not intelligence. He assumed that because the land was adjacent to the lake, it was identical in structure. But the geology of that region is highly localized. The only stable granite bedrock in the entire county, the only continuous, unbroken crust capable of bearing the immense structural load of your data center while simultaneously connecting directly to the geothermal cooling aquifer sits squarely and entirely beneath my home." I tapped the center of the topographical map. "The footprint of my property is the only viable real estate for this project. Period. And as we have already established, I have fortified that footprint. By purchasing those 3 adjacent flood zones, I did not just acquire mud. I acquired federally protected wetland buffer zones. You cannot pave them. You cannot rezone them. You cannot petition the city for an easement because federal environmental protection laws supersede Fulton County jurisdiction. I have built an impenetrable geographic and legal wall around the only safe harbor in a sea of collapsing limestone." The CEO stood up to his full height. He buttoned his suit jacket, his movements sharp and violently precise. He looked at Reginald, then at Julian, and finally at Sterling. You brought me a fraudulent proposal, the CEO stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. You promised me site control you did not have. You promised me geological stability you could not guarantee. You attempted to tether my global brand to a catastrophic liability. This memorandum of understanding is immediately terminated. If your firm attempts to use our corporate name or likeness in any future endeavors, my legal department will obliterate you. Wait! Julian shouted, panic completely hijacking his vocal cords. You cannot back out now. We have the bridge loan. We have the capital. The bank approved the $10 million based on our collateral. We own the central lot. We have the quitclaim deed registered with the county. She is lying about owning the center. We have the legal documents. I smiled. It was the moment I had been waiting for, the final fatal misstep. I closed the geological report and stepped back from the table, allowing the two federal litigators to step forward into the light. The taller of the two men, a sharp-featured attorney with predatory eyes, placed a small digital audio recorder and a stack of printed transcripts onto the mahogany wood. You might be wondering why I brought federal litigators to a real estate dispute, I said, addressing the room but keeping my eyes locked on Julian. You just claimed you have a registered quitclaim deed. You just claimed you used that deed to secure a $10 million commercial bridge loan from a federally insured bank. Julian froze. The blood completely drained from his face. His confident posture crumbled, replaced by the instinctual terror of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on a landmine. 3 days ago, I continued, my voice echoing like a gavel striking a block. I sat outside the Oak Room in Buckhead. I hired a former federal agent to sit inside the lounge. He carried a military-grade directional microphone. I listened as you and Sterling drank expensive scotch and celebrated your brilliant plan to bypass my ownership of the land. I reached down and pressed play on the digital recorder. Julian's voice, crisp and unmistakably arrogant, filled the quiet boardroom. I printed the standard quitclaim deed transferring ownership of Nia's cabin and the surrounding acreage directly to your development firm. I forged her signature on the bottom line. I took it to Marcus this morning. He stamped it, logged it into the county electronic registry, and officially authenticated it. The recording continued, capturing Sterling's panicked realization and Julian's subsequent boasting about using Reginald's corrupt connections to push the fraudulent document through the system. I let the audio run just long enough to capture Julian explicitly detailing his plan to use the forged deed to secure the $10 million federal bridge loan. Then I hit stop. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. Reginald gripped the edge of the table, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw breath. His entire empire, his pristine legal reputation, his untouchable legacy in Atlanta had just been incinerated by his own son's rampant stupidity. Forging a local deed is a state crime, the lead federal litigator stated, his voice calm and entirely devoid of mercy. But utilizing a forged document to fraudulently acquire a $10 million commercial loan from a federally insured banking institution constitutes federal bank fraud and wire fraud. Furthermore, conspiring with a licensed notary to alter municipal records implicates everyone involved in a coordinated criminal racketeering enterprise. The litigator turned to Reginald. We have already submitted the unedited audio files, the cloud backups, and the sworn affidavit of our private investigator to the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Georgia. The FBI is currently acquiring warrants for Marcus's notary logs, Sterling's corporate accounts, and Julian's personal communications. Julian stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of his chair. He looked at his father, his eyes wide with a pathetic, childish terror. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "Dad, do something. Tell them to stop." Reginald did not look at his son. He stared blankly at the mahogany table, his mouth slightly open, the realization of his own ruin washing over him. Reginald knew the law better than anyone in the room. He knew that Julian had explicitly implicated him on the audio recording by bragging about the past favors Reginald had done for the corrupt notary. Reginald was now an accessory to federal fraud. The Bar Association would strip his license. The feds would freeze his firm's assets. The social elite he so carefully cultivated would abandon him the moment the indictments were unsealed. Sterling dropped his face into his hands, letting out a ragged, suffocating sob. The $10 million loan sitting in his account was no longer a lifeline. It was the exact evidence the federal government needed to seize his development firm and send him to a maximum security penitentiary for the next 2 decades. The CEO of the tech conglomerate grabbed his briefcase. He did not say another word to the men at the table. He turned to me, gave a short, respectful nod of acknowledgement, and marched out of the boardroom, slamming the heavy glass doors behind him. I stood at the head of the table, looking down at the 3 men who had tried to systematically destroy my life. They had frozen my bank accounts. They had orchestrated viral smear campaigns to ruin my professional credibility. They had laughed at my pain and arrogantly assumed that their wealth and influence made them gods. "You told me I was out of my weight class," I said to Julian, my voice perfectly steady. "You told me I had no options left. You were so busy fighting a war of public relations and petty social manipulation that you completely forgot the most basic rule of structural integrity." I picked up my briefcase and secured the brass latches. "You never build a tower on a foundation of mud," I stated quietly. "And you never ever try to outmaneuver a scientist who controls the ground you walk on." I turned my back on the ruined, broken men and walked out of the glass boardroom flanked by the federal attorneys. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the doors slid shut, sealing away the panicked, frantic shouting that suddenly erupted from the boardroom, I let out a long, slow breath. The war was over. I had protected my land, I had secured my future, and I had left their glittering, arrogant empire in a pile of federal ashes. The elevator began its smooth, silent descent, a pressurized glide that was supposed to carry me away from the wreckage and out into the crisp Atlanta morning. I watched the digital floor indicator tick down, the adrenaline slowly receding from my veins. But before the display could even register the 48th floor, the carriage violently jolted to an abrupt stomach-dropping halt. The emergency override system engaged with a sharp mechanical clunk, bathing the small space in a harsh amber light. The heavy steel doors slid open, revealing the tech conglomerate's head of corporate security. He was a massive, imposing man with a coiled earpiece, and his expression was entirely devoid of warmth. "Ms. Obsidian," he said, his voice a low, authoritative rumble. "The CEO has requested that you return to the executive suite immediately. Reginald is presenting counter-evidence." I did not sigh. I did not flinch. I simply adjusted my grip on my leather briefcase, gave the security chief a curt nod, and stepped back out onto the top floor. The war, it seemed, required one final execution. When I walked back into the glass-walled boardroom, the atmosphere had drastically shifted. The initial shockwave of my geological revelation had passed, and Reginald had slipped into the one persona that had made him the most feared corporate attorney in the Southeast. He was in full survival mode. He had stripped off his suit jacket, his sleeves rolled up, his hands planted firmly on the mahogany table. He was projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable legal authority, desperately trying to wrestle control of the narrative back from the abyss. Sterling and Julian were hovering behind him like frightened children hiding behind a shield. The tech CEO was still standing at the head of the table, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression dark and skeptical. As I approached the table, flanked once again by my federal litigators, Reginald pointed a rigid, accusatory finger directly at my chest. "Do not listen to a single word this woman says." Reginald bellowed, his voice resonating with the practiced theatrical outrage of a courtroom veteran. "She is a disgruntled, bitter ex-wife who is currently drowning in the middle of a highly contentious, financially devastating divorce. She is trying to disrupt a completely legal, federally compliant commercial sale out of sheer, unadulterated spite." Reginald reached into Sterling's leather portfolio and pulled out a single crisp document. He slammed it down onto the center of the mahogany table, smoothing his hand over the heavy cardstock. It was the trump card. It was the very document that Julian had bragged about securing. "This is the official, legally binding quitclaim deed for the Central Lake Lanier property," Reginald announced, his voice ringing with aggressive triumph. "It is stamped, it is verified, and it is fully registered with the Fulton County Clerk. It bears her exact signature. It legally transfers all rights, title, and interest of that land directly to Sterling's development firm. The CEO looked down at the document, his eyes scanning the notary seal and the signature line. Reginald pressed his advantage, leaning closer to the tech magnate. That digital audio she played for you earlier was a complete fabrication, Reginald insisted, his tone dripping with condescension. We live in an era of artificial intelligence and deepfakes. Any desperate, vindictive amateur can splice together a synthetic audio file to make it sound like my son is confessing to a crime. She manufactured that recording to stall this acquisition, because she knows she legally signed away her rights to the property. Look at the paper. Look at the county seal. This is empirical, undeniable legal proof of site control. She has nothing but a fabricated tape and a vendetta. Julian puffed out his chest, emboldened by his father's aggressive defense. She is crazy, Julian chimed in, his voice cracking slightly. She has been trying to extort us for months. You cannot let her derail a billion-dollar infrastructure project with a fake recording. Sterling nodded vigorously, sweat beading on his forehead. The bank verified it, he pleaded, looking at the CEO. The federal underwriters verified the deed. It is real. We own the land. The tech CEO slowly lifted his gaze from the document and looked at me. The silence in the room was suffocating, thick with the smell of expensive cologne and desperate fear. Reginald stood tall, a smug, victorious sneer beginning to form on his lips. He honestly believed he had won. He believed that the sheer force of his reputation combined with a piece of stamped paper was enough to override reality. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or attempt to defend my character. I did not even look at the forged document sitting on the table. Instead, I calmly reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I walked past Reginald, ignoring his presence entirely, and moved toward the sleek state of the art audiovisual control console built into the wall of the boardroom. I tapped the glowing glass screen, navigating through the corporate menus until I found the wireless pairing options. May I asked, looking directly at the tech CEO. The CEO's eyes narrowed, but he gave a single sharp nod of permission. I connected my phone to the boardroom's integrated Bluetooth audio system. The system was designed for global teleconferencing, equipped with high-fidelity surround sound speakers embedded seamlessly into the ceiling. I bypassed the heavily edited compressed audio snippet I had played earlier. I opened the raw, uncompressed master file, the exact feed that Vance had captured from the directional microphone at the cigar lounge. Reginald, I said, turning to face him with a cold, terrifying smile. You are absolutely right about one thing. We do live in an era of deepfakes and artificial intelligence, but we also live in an era of digital metadata, localized acoustic rendering, and high-definition federal surveillance. I tapped the play button on my screen. The crystal-clear audio did not just play, it engulfed the room. The surround sound speakers perfectly replicated the acoustic environment of the Oak Room. You could hear the exact spatial distance between Julian and Sterling. You could hear the ice shifting in their glasses. You could hear the faint, unmistakable voice of a specific lounge waitress in the background asking if they needed another round of Macallan. It was impossible to fake that level of ambient environmental authenticity. Then Julian's voice boomed from the ceiling speakers, completely unfiltered and devastatingly clear. I forged her signature on the bottom line. It was remarkably easy to copy from our old joint tax returns. I took it to Marcus this morning. He stamped it, logged it into the county electronic registry, and officially authenticated it. As far as the state of Georgia is concerned, Nia happily signed over her property today at noon. Reginald's smug smile vanished. The color began to drain from his face, but the recording was not finished. I had let the tape run longer this time, exposing the darkest, most radioactive part of their conspiracy. On the audio, Sterling's panicked voice echoed through the boardroom. Are you out of your mind? If the bank finds out we are using a falsified deed to secure a $10 million commercial loan, we are looking at federal bank fraud. That is 20 years in a federal penitentiary, Julian. And then came the kill shot. Julian's arrogant, dismissive laughter filled the room, followed by the words that would officially end his father's career. They are not going to find out, Julian's voice bragged from the speakers. Marcus owes my father a massive favor from a DU. I charge a few years back that Reginald quietly made disappear. Marcus has a very flexible moral compass when it comes to repaying his debts to the family. And even if Nia figures it out, Dad will just bury her in so much expensive corporate litigation, she will spend the rest of her life in court. Dad knows exactly how to protect this deal. He gave me the green light to handle the notary. I reached out and paused the audio. The silence that slammed into the boardroom was absolute crushing and completely final. I looked at Reginald. The transformation was staggering. The aristocratic, powerful attorney had entirely vanished. He looked like a hollow, terrified old man. The blood had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. His hands were trembling so violently he had to grip the edge of the mahogany table just to keep himself standing. He was not just listening to his son confess to forgery, he was listening to his son implicate him directly in a coordinated conspiracy to commit federal bank fraud, witness tampering, and racketeering. Julian had practically gift-wrapped his father for the Department of Justice. The tech CEO did not need to be a lawyer to understand the catastrophic liability standing in his boardroom. The CEO turned his back on Reginald and looked directly at his own lead corporate counsel, who was standing quietly by the door. "Kill it!" The CEO ordered, his voice echoing with absolute unforgiving authority. "Void the memorandum of understanding immediately. Freeze all communications with Sterling Development and their subsidiaries. Contact the bank and notify their fraud department that we are officially severing all ties with this firm due to gross misrepresentation of assets. I want our corporate name completely scrubbed from this catastrophic liability before the hour is up." The counsel nodded rapidly, already typing the directives into his tablet. "Wait," Sterling pleaded, falling to his knees. His voice was a high, hysterical keen. "Please, you cannot do this. The bank will call the loan. My firm will go bankrupt. We will lose everything. Please, I can fix this. I can find another site." The CEO looked down at Sterling with an expression of total disgust. "You do not have a firm anymore," he said coldly. "You have a crime scene. Do not ever attempt to contact this company again." The CEO turned, picked up his briefcase, and walked out of the room, leaving the shattered remains of the empire in his wake. I disconnected my phone from the Bluetooth system and slipped it back into my pocket. The two federal litigators standing beside me began packing up their files, their expressions completely neutral. The trap had snapped shut with flawless precision. Julian was hyperventilating, backing away from the table and pressing himself against the glass wall of the boardroom. He looked at his father, his eyes wide and leaking tears of sheer panic. "Dad," Julian whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "Dad, I am sorry. I thought it would work. You said we could handle her. You said she was weak." Reginald slowly lifted his head and looked at his son. There was no love in his eyes. There was no paternal protection. There was only the dead, vacant stare of a man who had just realized his entire legacy, his prestigious law firm, his wealth, and his freedom had been entirely annihilated by the very arrogance he had instilled in his children. I picked up my briefcase and snapped the brass latches shut. The sharp clicks caused Julian to flinch. "You told me I did not belong in your world, Reginald," I said, my voice calm, even, and totally devoid of sympathy. "You told me I was nothing but a temporary inconvenience. You spent years treating people like disposable assets, assuming your money and your connections made you completely immune to consequence." I walked toward the door, my heels clicking a steady rhythmic cadence against the hardwood floor. I paused just before exiting and looked back at the three men. They were frozen in a tableau of absolute ruin. Sterling sobbing on the floor, Julian shaking against the glass, Reginald staring into the void. "I am a scientist, Reginald," I stated, my tone dropping to a cold clinical whisper. "I study systems, I study pressure, and I know exactly where to apply force to make a corrupt structure collapse under its own weight. Enjoy the federal indictments." I turned and walked out of the boardroom. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind me, sealing the toxic, suffocating panic inside. The air in the hallway felt incredibly light. I pressed the button for the elevator, watching the digital numbers begin their ascent. The mud they had dragged me through had finally washed away, and I was stepping out into a future that belonged entirely undeniably to me. But true eradication requires zero loose ends. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, its polished silver doors sliding open to offer a clean, effortless escape. I stared into the empty carriage for a fraction of a second. I listened to the muffled, chaotic shouting bleeding through the heavy frosted glass of the boardroom down the hall. The tech CEO and his primary counsel had already evacuated the premises through the private executive corridor, wanting zero proximity to the legal radioactive fallout. As he passed me in the lobby moments earlier, the CEO's lead attorney had paused, checked his watch, and quietly informed me that building security would be conducting a sweep in exactly 10 minutes. 10 minutes to handle my private family business before the entire floor was locked down and the corporate authorities intervened. I let the elevator doors slide shut. The digital indicator above the frame went dark. I adjusted the grip on my leather briefcase, turned on my heel, and walked back toward the slaughterhouse. When I pushed the heavy glass doors open and stepped back into the boardroom, the shouting instantly died. The three men jerked their heads toward me, their faces pale and slick with panicked sweat. The federal litigators had stepped out into the hall to maintain a perimeter, leaving me completely alone with Reginald Sterling and Julian. The power dynamic in the room had fundamentally inverted. The predators were now cornered, bleeding and desperately waiting for the final blow. I walked back to the center of the massive mahogany table. I placed my briefcase down, snapped the brass latches open, and withdrew 3 thick, professionally bound legal folders. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I spoke with the icy mechanical precision of a surgeon preparing to amputate. You have exactly 8 minutes before the tech conglomerate's security team sweeps this floor and hands the physical premises over to the authorities, I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy, stagnant air. You have 2 options. Option A is that I walk out of this building, hand the unedited audio files to the federal litigators waiting in the hallway, and watch the FBI dismantle your lives before sunset. Option B is that you meet my exact terms right here, right now. If you do, the audio file remains locked in my offshore vault, and you get to walk out of this building as free men. Ruined, but free. Reginald swallowed hard. His throat clicked audibly in the quiet room. What are your terms? He asked, his voice entirely stripped of its former aristocratic arrogance. It was the raspy, hollow croak of a broken man. I slid the first heavy legal folder across the polished wood. It came to a stop directly in front of Julian. We will start with the husband of the year, I said, staring into Julian's wide, terrified eyes. Open it. Julian's hands were shaking so violently he could barely grasp the cover. He fumbled with the heavy cardstock, flipping it open to reveal a stack of densely typed legal decrees. That is a globally binding irrevocable asset relinquishment agreement, I explained, pacing slowly behind my chair. You are going to sign away every single right claim and future entitlement to any marital assets we currently dispute. You will authorize the immediate lifting of the freeze on all of my personal and business checking accounts. You will transfer the entirety of your liquid stock portfolio into my primary holding account by close of business today as restitution for financial abuse. You will walk away from this divorce with nothing but the clothes on your back and the car you drove here in. Julian looked up, his face contorted in a mix of indignation and horror. Nia, that is everything, he stammered, a pathetic whine edging into his voice. That is my entire personal net worth. I will not have a dime to my name. You cannot leave me with absolutely nothing. I leaned over the table, bracing my weight on my hands, bringing my face inches from his. You forged my signature on a county document to steal my home, Julian. I am giving you the extraordinary privilege of choosing poverty over a federal prison cell. Pick up the pen. Julian looked to his father for intervention, a desperate, silent plea for a legal loophole or a rescue strategy. Reginald did not even look at him. Reginald kept his eyes locked on the mahogany grain, his posture rigid with defeat. With a ragged, breathless sob, Julian picked up the heavy gold fountain pen sitting on the table. His hand trembled as he dragged the ink across the signature lines, authorizing his own total financial ruin. He signed document after document, tearing through the pages with frantic, terrified speed. When he finished, he pushed the folder back toward me, burying his face in his hands, completely broken. I ignored his crying. I slid the second folder across the table, aiming it precisely at Sterling. It hit his portfolio with a sharp thwack. Sterling flinched, his eyes darting frantically from the folder to my face. "Your turn, Sterling," I said, my voice maintaining its flat, relentless cadence. "You attempted to use my property to secure a billion-dollar development deal. You lied to investors, you lied to the bank, and you conspired to commit federal wire fraud. Your firm is effectively dead. But the bank still deposited a $10 million commercial bridge loan into your operating account this morning." Sterling's breath hitched. He stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. "That folder contains a vendor payout authorization," I explained, tapping the cover with my fingernail. "It dictates that Obsidian Lithos LLC, my company, provided emergency high-level environmental and geological consulting services to your firm over the past 72 hours. The cost of those highly specialized consulting fees is exactly $10 million. You are going to sign the wire transfer authorization, draining every single cent of your firm's remaining capital, including the newly deposited bridge loan, directly into my offshore corporate accounts." Sterling leaped out of his chair clattering backward against the glass wall. "Are you insane?" he shrieked, his voice cracking wildly. "That loan is the only capital I have left. If I transfer that money to you, the bank will immediately audit my accounts. When they see the funds are gone and the tech deal is dead, they will seize my company. They will liquidate my firm. I will be bankrupt by Friday." I stood perfectly still, letting his hysteria burn itself out against the quiet indifference of the boardroom. "If you do not sign the transfer, Sterling, the bank will audit your accounts anyway because the tech conglomerate is voiding your memorandum right now." I countered, my logic brutally cold and inescapable. "When they audit you, they will find the forged quitclaim deed. They will call the FBI. You will lose the firm, and you will spend the next 20 years locked in a concrete box eating terrible food. If you sign the money over to me as a consulting fee, the bank seizes a bankrupt company, but no one goes to jail. You get to go home to Vivian. You get to sleep in your own bed." I looked at the heavy gold clock on the wall. "You have 3 minutes left. Choose." Sterling let out a sound that was half scream, half groan. He grabbed the folder, flipped to the final page, and violently scrawled his signature across the wire authorization form. He signed his corporate death warrant with aggressive weeping strokes, the ink bleeding into the heavy paper. He threw the pen across the table, dropping his head onto the polished wood, totally incapacitated by his own catastrophic failure. I pulled the second folder back, stacking it neatly on top of Julian's. 2 men down, 1 left. I picked up the third and final folder. It was thinner than the others. It did not need to be thick to be devastating. I walked slowly to the head of the table and placed it gently in front of Reginald. Reginald finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, the arrogant spark completely extinguished. He looked like an ancient, crumbling ruin of a man. "You always prided yourself on being the smartest man in the room, Reginald," I said quietly, addressing him with a terrifying degree of calm. "You built an entire dynasty on intimidation loopholes and silencing people who did not have the resources to fight back. You enabled your son's worst instincts because you believed your legal standing made you a god in this city." I gestured to the thin folder. "That is a formal letter of immediate voluntary surrender to the State Bar of Georgia," I stated. "It stipulates that due to sudden and severe health concerns, you are permanently forfeiting your license to practice law in this state or any other state, effective immediately. You are stepping down as the senior managing partner of your firm. You will never set foot in a courtroom again. You will never sign another legal document. You will retire quietly, instantly, and permanently today." Reginald's hands hovered over the folder. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid movements. "Nia," he rasped, his voice a broken, fragile whisper. "My firm is my life. My practice is everything I have built. You are asking me to erase my entire identity. Please, take the money, take Julian's accounts, take Sterling's firm. But let me keep my license. Let me keep my name. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a low, lethal pitch that ensured only he could hear the absolute finality in my words. Your name is a poison, Reginald. Your firm is a weapon you use to destroy people who got in your way. You taught Julian that laws do not apply to your family. You taught Sterling that greed overrides integrity. You built a machine designed to crush people like me. And today, I am taking away the keys to the machine. I tapped the signature line. Sign the letter, Reginald. Or I walk out the door and the FBI indicts you for federal conspiracy and racketeering. You will not just lose your license. You will lose your freedom and your legacy will be immortalized in a federal prison registry. Sign it. Reginald stared into my eyes for a long, agonizing moment. He was searching for a bluff, a sliver of hesitation, a microscopic crack in my armor. He found absolutely nothing. I was a fortress of cold, empirical resolve. He slowly lowered his gaze to the paper. His hand shook terribly as he picked up the pen. It took him 3 attempts to steady his grip enough to write. With a slow, agonizingly deliberate motion, Reginald signed his name. He surrendered his power, his identity, and his untouchable legacy. The stroke of his pen was the final defining collapse of the empire. I reached out and pulled the folder from his trembling hands. I stacked it on top of the others, squared the edges of the heavy paper, and placed them meticulously back into my leather briefcase. I snapped the twin brass latches shut. The sharp clicks echoed with absolute finality. I stood up straight, smoothing the lapels of my blazer. I looked down the length of the magnificent mahogany table. Julian was silently weeping into his hands. Sterling was curled inwards, staring blankly at the floor. Reginald sat frozen like a statue of a defeated king, staring at the space where his career had just evaporated. I did not offer a parting warning. I did not deliver a final, dramatic monologue. True power does not require a monologue. It only requires execution. I turned my back on the wreckage, gripped the handle of my briefcase, and walked out of the boardroom. I pushed the heavy glass doors open and stepped into the quiet hallway, leaving the 3 men alone in the suffocating silence of their own absolute, self-inflicted ruin. The elevator doors stood open and waiting. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the lobby, and began my descent. By the time the elevator reached the ground floor, the shockwaves of my execution had already begun to ripple outward. The dismantling of the family empire was not a slow decay, it was a rapid, spectacular freefall. The trap I had meticulously set and triggered in that boardroom did not just stop a real estate transaction. It unleashed an absolute avalanche of financial and social ruin that wiped them off the map. Without the tech conglomerates backing and utterly drained of $10 million in working capital, Sterling's development company went into an immediate, irreversible tailspin. The bank, alerted by the sudden voiding of the memorandum, moved with ruthless, terrifying efficiency. They audited his accounts, discovered the fraudulent nature of the collateral, and froze every single corporate and personal asset Sterling possessed. Bankruptcy court was a brutal, highly public affair. Creditors swarmed like starving locusts, fighting over the scraps of his shattered business. Within 2 weeks, the bank foreclosed on his sprawling Buckhead mansion. I watched the local news coverage with a detached sense of satisfaction as repossession agents hauled away his fleet of luxury vehicles. Sterling was left standing in his driveway, clutching a cardboard box of office supplies, completely stripped of the corporate armor he had used to hide his sheer incompetence. Julian fared even worse. The asset relinquishment agreement he had frantically signed under the threat of federal prison legally stripped him of every last dime. His offshore accounts were drained. His vast stock portfolios were permanently transferred to my holding company. His luxury penthouse was seized to cover outstanding legal fees and debts. Stripped of his trust fund and his father's protective financial umbrella, Julian was forced to move into a cramped, noisy apartment complex on the industrial outskirts of the city. He had to pawn his collection of designer watches just to make his first month of rent. The man who had endlessly mocked my salary and arrogantly forged my signature was now experiencing the terrifying, unfamiliar reality of actual poverty. He had absolutely no marketable skills, no work ethic, and no safety net. The scandal could not be contained to the boardroom. The truth about the forged quitclaim deed and the subsequent federal investigation leaked to the local press, and Dominique's glittering social media empire shattered overnight. The high-end fashion and lifestyle brands that sponsored her carefully curated aesthetic dropped her contracts instantly, terrified of the toxic public relations disaster associated with wire fraud and corporate corruption. Her millions of followers turned on her with brutal speed. She attempted a tearful, unscripted apology video on a live stream, deflecting the blame onto her father and brothers, but the internet was merciless. The comment section tore her apart, mocking her sudden fall from grace. She was forced to delete her accounts, entirely silencing the digital megaphone she had used to harass and belittle me for years. Reginald surrendered his law license on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, stepping down from the prestigious firm he had built with decades of intimidation and corruption. The federal prosecutors declined to indict him, choosing instead to let his absolute professional disgrace serve as a permanent, humiliating warning to the legal community. His name was stripped from the firm's letterhead. But the ultimate, most devastating punishment fell upon Vivian. Atlanta's elite social circles are notoriously unforgiving to losers. Her prestigious country club memberships were suddenly and quietly revoked. Her coveted invitations to charity galas, private auctions, and society luncheons simply stopped arriving. When she attempted to show up at her favorite upscale boutique in Buckhead, pretending everything was normal, she was met with cold, polite indifference from the very women who used to hang on her every word. The whispering followed her everywhere. Vivian was completely exiled from the only world she cared about, humiliated, isolated, and forced to live out her days within the claustrophobic ruins of her husband's shattered legacy. While their world burned to the ground, mine was just taking flight. The tech conglomerate still needed to build their billion-dollar data center. They still needed access to the geothermal aquifer, and they still desperately needed the surrounding buffer zones to comply with federal environmental regulations. But this time, they were dealing directly with the actual legal owner of the land. I did not sit in a smoke-filled cigar lounge and make arrogant, empty promises. I sat in a brightly lit, legitimate legal office and negotiated a masterful corporate land lease. The tech CEO respected empirical evidence and competence, and my geological surveys were flawless. I signed the 50-year corporate land lease for $85 million. I retained full mineral and access rights to my property, protected the ecological integrity of the surrounding forest, and provided the conglomerate with the exact infrastructural footprint they required. The transaction was clean, transparent, and highly lucrative. I used a fraction of that newly acquired capital to launch Obsidian Environmental Consulting. I purchased a sleek, modern commercial space in Midtown Atlanta, outfitting it with state-of-the-art technology. I hired a brilliant team of top-tier geologists, structural engineers, and environmental litigators. We specialized in identifying fraudulent commercial real estate developments and protecting vulnerable, everyday landowners from predatory corporate developers. I built an entirely new empire, but mine was rooted in empirical truth, structural integrity, and absolute accountability. A month after the lease was finalized, I stood on the private balcony of my new executive suite. I wore a perfectly tailored emerald green suit, a subtle personal nod to the night I watched Sterling dig his own grave at the gala. I leaned against the heavy glass railing, holding a steaming cup of coffee, and looked out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The morning sun reflected brilliantly off the surrounding skyscrapers, casting the city in a warm, golden light. The air was crisp and clean. I was no longer the isolated, underestimated wife hiding in the shadows of a toxic, manipulative family. I was wealthy beyond comprehension. I was professionally untouchable. I was entirely, completely free. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest, ready to conquer whatever challenge came next. They thought they could bury me under their lies and their money, but they forgot one thing. I'm a geologist. I know exactly how to handle the dirt. Have you ever had a toxic family member try to take what's yours? How did you fight back? Drop your story in the comments below.